You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Well, here we are, back for another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
And Todd, we have had all kinds of technical difficulties and challenges trying to get to this point, haven't we?
This one episode, I think, is cursed, maybe. Maybe there's some devil somewhere that really doesn't want this recorded or something.
Yes, we were meant to record this episode a few days ago.
Yep.
And you had internet downtime.
Yes, internet difficulties here.
Yes, so we had to, at the very last moment, reschedule.
Yep.
And we are very grateful to our guest today, who was very accommodating and has been able to reschedule this episode. And then today, we've had more technical difficulties with microphones not operating properly and things like that. So, well, anyway... we are trying to overcome the difficulties, and we've got a really fun episode, I think, lined up today.
I hope so, yeah.
So anyway, before we get into today's episode, I just wanted to say as well, Todd, that we've been very encouraged, haven't we, with all the messages of appreciation that we've been receiving about the podcast. And
we get regular emails.
We do.
Daily, every other day. It's pretty frequent. So, yeah, keep them coming. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and so that reminds us, right at the beginning of this episode, if you are enjoying the podcast and you're appreciating what we're doing, then do remember to leave us a like, share our episodes with your friends, subscribe, leave us a positive review, all of those things, because all of that helps to make us more visible to other people and makes it easier for them to find us. Having said that, today's episode is going to sort of be a delve into quite an interesting topic. It's something that I think both of us have been thinking about quite a lot for some time.
For years, yeah. It's gone off and on in my head for years, yeah.
Yeah. And basically the topic is what's in a name. We want to think about, what do we call ourselves? What labels do we apply to our position, to the position that we hold? Obviously, we're creationists. But what kind of creationists are we? Are we young earth creationists? Are we 6-day creationists? Are we new creationists? Or are we something else? And does it really matter? Does it matter what labels we give to ourselves and to our position? And so in this episode, we wanted to dig into all of the various options that are on the table and think about the various pros and cons of these different names, and think about, where do we go from here? And in order to do this, we've actually invited a very special guest, my good friend and my colleague in Biblical Creation Trust, Dr. Stephen Lloyd. Stephen recently wrote a piece in our prayer news, our newsletter, all about this question of what do we call ourselves. And Todd, you read that piece, and it kind of spurred you to write another blog post also about this topic. So it's definitely something that in the last few weeks we've had our attention focused on, haven't we? So Stephen, it is great to have you with us for this episode of the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Now, Stephen, I've already mentioned that you work with me in Biblical Creation Trust. But how about you just introduce yourself for the benefit of our listeners? Just tell them a bit about yourself and your background and your interest in creationism.
Well, currently I work partly for Biblical Creation Trust, and I'm also the pastor of a small Baptist church in Gravesend in Kent in England. And I've been at the church now for about 13 years. I guess my sort of career before that was as a scientist. I studied natural sciences, material science at University of Cambridge, did a PhD there in electron microscopy. I did further postdoctoral research. I was pretty much embarked on a sort of academic research career, but in the end, the call to the ministry sort of won out. And I think the whole thing about creation, I remember sort of going to university thinking, I'm not terribly interested in this, but people in the church are going to ask me about this, because they say, well, you studied science, what are we meant to think about this whole issue? So I sort of felt I had a duty to sort of know something about it. And I remember thinking quite early on, what one book will give me all the answers. And it suddenly dawned on me, I think in my first year as an undergrad, actually, this book didn't exist. And actually, there was a whole pile of stuff that didn't have any answers. And, there were various contacts I made. There was actually an email network. This was more as a postgrad that Todd was on, and various other creationists. This was back in the sort of mid-90s. That's probably where I started learning the most about the sort of more informed sort of creationism, if we're going to use a label, and met with you, Paul, and yeah. So there's more I could say, but yeah, that'll do.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. So you've been thinking about these kinds of topics for a very long time, and since 2011, I think it is, you've been working as a researcher and lecturer as well with Biblical Creation Trust. So it's become quite a big part of you.
2007, actually.
2007. Oh, it's been longer than I than I remembered, and so it's become a very big, part of your ministry. Now, this question of what we call ourselves, it turns out not to be a straightforward issue. It actually is quite a complex question and has many different layers to it, I think. I wonder whether we could begin perhaps just by exploring the question of why should we even be concerned about labels? Why bother? Why can't we just call ourselves creationists and be done with it? What's the importance of having these labels?
Well, in one sense, I think we can and we do call ourselves creationists because it's the most straightforward, simple label that, at least to the non-Christian world, makes sense. Or you believe in God and you think God made everything. When theistic evolutionists try and use that term, I think it, on the argument, well, we believe God is also a creator, he just did it in a different way. I think that does come across quite strangely to the sort of non-Christian world. So, so a creationist has something to be said for it, but it doesn't really say much about the details of what we believe or how, the different sort of forms of that. And the problem, I think, is that the labels do sort of shape the debate. And I think, we've seen this with, other things in creationism, the whole sort of, when people talked about transitional forms, sort of people like, Kurt Wise was saying, well, actually, that's in the end an evolutionary term. Let's be more descriptive and call them, stratomorphic intermediates. And it's sort of reclaiming the terminology in a way that is, helpful in accurately explaining where we're coming from.
And similarly in baraminology, we've had to really think carefully about the terminology that we use, because the terminology, the conventional terminology, is so embedded in an evolutionary worldview that we kind of have to go back to scratch, really. So what are we looking for in a label? What do we need a label to do for us? What do we want it to achieve?
Well, it has to be a simplification, because that's the whole point. To me, I think you're going to use different labels in different settings. If I was appearing on a, secular radio program, a label like creationist or something, it would probably sort of do. If you're speaking at a conference with sort of a load of other evangelical Christians talking about creation with different positions, then, something that defines your position a bit more is going to be helpful. And I think the other thing is maybe something that cuts across stereotypes, because I think part of the problem is people think they already know what you believe or what your position is, whereas half the time you're actually trying to undo some of the wrong perceptions people have. So I guess I've always been quite favorable to trying to produce labels that are a bit provocative, almost slightly inaccurate, actually, simply just to try and counter some of that sort of stereotype.
I've always found it, to be honest, I've always found it fun to shoot down the stereotypes. Yes, I am a creationist. And yes, I know more about the science of evolution than you do, most likely. When it comes to random people that I meet on the internet, it's always been weird to me that I've been able, through my secular career, a lot of the colleagues that I interacted with, students and so forth, and postdocs, I felt like I could articulate a better argument for evolution than they could. And I think that's good. I think that is how we ought to be. We ought to know these things really well and be able to talk about them. And yeah, so there's a certain power to subverting the expectations of people when they think, you're just stupid and I shouldn't have to listen to you. On the other hand, there's also, flat out, bias and bigotry where they're not going to listen to you, even though you are very knowledgeable and well informed. So, yeah, I can see both sides.
Yeah.
I mean, I think an example of one of the earliest times I sort of did that, this was back as a postgraduate student, meeting up, just a handful of us meeting up with, some of us sort of coming from where I was, but also some others more theistic evolution. And I think we told them this was going to be a talk about young fossil evolution, or maybe young fossil evolutionary floodism. And that was a sort of an early exercise in trying to sort of reclaim the agenda of the debate and just sort of explain where that comes from. I mean, if we're arguing, essentially my argument for the young bit comes from, death coming after Adam's sin. So assuming Adam is reasonably recent, at least relative to evolutionary timescales, that's going to place the fossils of dead creatures after Adam. So we're talking about, so it's focusing on that argument of death in calling it young fossil as opposed to sort of young Earth. Evolutionary to basically counter the idea that we believe in the fixity of species, that in a creation model you have an awful lot of change over a short time. It's a bit disingenuous using evolution in that way because it's different obviously to how the standard mechanism of evolution works, but that's why we did it anyway. It was to counter that stereotype. And then the floodism was the fact that in a sense we're not so much creationists as floodists, in that we don't have an awful lot to say about the original creation, but we've got a lot to say about the flood, both geologically, but also, biologically. In a sense, our job today is to explain how the sort of the variety of life we find today and the places we find it today came from all the creatures that were on the ark. So that's why we sort of put that focus on flood, which again is often ignored by Christians. They sort of think that flood's irrelevant, whereas the flood is in some ways the more central doctrine.
And quite often, subverting people's expectations in this way can be a good conversation starter, can't it? It can sort of intrigue people because they come with all of these preconceptions. They come with all of this baggage. They think they know what you're about, and actually quite often they don't at all.
No idea.
No idea. And being able to sort of, intrigue them in that way helps to get a conversation going. So that's very helpful. Now, obviously, that one of the main labels that's used to describe creationists is young Earth creationist. So I guess we should begin by thinking about young Earth creationist. I'm not sure where that label came from originally, whether it was something that was self-applied by creationists to themselves, or whether it was something that we were called by others. But it's become a label that has stuck. So what do you think are some of the pros and cons of that particular label, Young Earth Creationist, Stephen?
Well, it does do the job of distinguishing us from people that are accepting the sort of evolutionary timescale, even if they're saying that sort of God has created everything miraculously at different points, a sort of old Earth creationism. So it does sort of that job of distinguishing a position. I think one of the problems is it doesn't really focus on, or it's not immediately obvious why does this, in that terminology, the age of the Earth matter? Why does it matter that the Earth is young or old? And actually, in a young Earth framework, thousands and thousands of years to me actually is a long time. So it's only young relative to a framework that we disagree with. So you're sort of defining yourself by your opponents, which is slightly strange. But I think culturally it has a problem in that it's almost a sociological label. It's the way it's heard, at least by people in this country, it's you'd be seen as something American if you say you're a young Earth creationist, and it would be assumed. And it would be assumed that you voted Republican, which has got absolutely nothing to do with the issue whatsoever. But that is how it sort of categorizes this sort of social group. And also you'd be basically seen as a sort of dangerous, unhinged lunatic. It has that sort of connotation in the wider culture. So those, and that, isn't a sort of, doesn't have to sort of totally floor using it, because after all, Christians have always been despised in different ways. That's fair enough, but it's more the sort of inaccuracy of it that bothers me.
Now, Todd, there is a kind of variation, isn't there, on young Earth creationism, which is young age creationism,
right?
Do you want to just unpack that a little bit, Todd?
Yeah, sure.
About how this term arose and why it's different from young Earth creationism.
Yeah, I heard it from Kurt Wise 30 or 20 some odd years ago. And he wanted to distinguish that, it's not just the Earth that's young, right? He just said everything's young. So the age of things is young, not old. So technically you could be a young Earth creationist, right? But still just shrug your shoulders at the Big Bang and conventional cosmogony and say that, hey, the universe is billions, but the Earth is young. I'm not sure specifically there are any that do that anymore. I know that there are some that have a sort of an old universe, recent life position. But that's different from actually de novo creating the Earth thousands of years ago. But anyway, that was a shade of meaning that he wanted to emphasize. I've sort of adopted that, and I try to use that over the young Earth creation, which I think is less specific. I think he's right about that. So that's where that came from. But it's interesting that you mentioned, where does the young Earth where does the young Earth label come from? Because I am not entirely sure. I've looked up where creationists came from. Ron Numbers has a nice paper about that, that talks about how that terminology has changed over the years and come to be applied to essentially the young Earth position. But the actual descriptor young Earth, I'm not sure where that came from. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, that would be an interesting project for a student to look at that.
And it sort of brings up, just this thought of of how these labels travel in history, because we're sort of talking about this as being a sort of a new label, because I think if you'd asked someone, John Calvin or something, are you a young Earth creationist, I think he wouldn't quite have understood the question. It's just not the sort of terminology they would have used. So I don't think this is essential, but I think if you can have a label that does potentially travel through history, that that does help in sort of showing the continuity of what we are saying with just mainstream Christianity. I mean, almost one of the things I'm always trying to do is to say, well, actually, there's nothing odd going on here. There's nothing to see here. This is just normal, mainstream, bog standard Christianity that people have believed, down the centuries. We're just normal. So, and a label that reflects that would be a good idea.
Yeah, sure. And another label which is kind of often closely associated with young earth creationism is 6-day creationism.
Yeah.
I've heard lots of creationists who describe themselves that way. They say, I'm a 6-day creationist. And I think that's got some potential drawbacks as well, Stephen. Do you want to just talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the label draws your attention to presumably what you think is most important. And so you're putting this emphasis on 6 days as if it's how long the days are in Genesis that is the most important thing. And I don't want to minimize its importance. This is scripture. This is what God says. Everything is really important. But it's not immediately obvious why it's of theological significance, how long the days are. Whereas a sort of argument more about death and suffering, I think, does have a more direct, implication for the atonement, the resurrection, and just core Christian theology. So that's where I would always want to sort of more focus on. So I think it puts the emphasis in the wrong place. And I think you also have this problem of are you a literal creationist? Are you, this whole use of this term sort of literal, which, we sort of know what people are getting at, but it's sort of, missing the point, when, Jesus talks about being a gate or something, he doesn't mean he's a block of wood. There's, and you can have metaphor, you can have all sorts of literary stuff going on in what is a, if you like, historical account, which is to me what goes on in Genesis. There are bits of metaphor in there. There are, but it's so yeah. So I think the term literal is generally pretty unhelpful.
Yeah, sure. One of the other terms that has become quite popular, at least with certain people these days, is the label new creationist or neo-creationist.
Yes.
And this is a label that some of us have applied to our own position.
Some people have written books.
Some of us have written books.
Some of us wrote books about it, yeah.
I wrote a book, The New Creationism, and partly I did that because I wanted to emphasize what I did think was new about creationism since, for example, the publication of the Genesis flood in 1961, because there are lots of people who've heard about creationism, think they know what it's all about, but actually don't really know very much about creationism in its modern form. And but lots of people have asked me about that. What's this new creationism? How is it different from the old creationism? And more recently, of course, others have applied this label to us. They see something distinctively different about perhaps a new, younger generation of creationists. Todd, what do you think about this term, new creationist? Is it a very helpful term, do you think?
I guess it depends on what you think you're trying to do. So in my younger years, when I was new at this, and I was getting in more, how would I say this, more aware of the wide variety of creationists. And I became aware of sort of this, how would we describe this? Sort of the fringe, the far wing of creationists, where you have people who they go hunt for Bigfoot and they talk about UFOs and they think the government is out to get them. And then you have, beyond that, you have some who are just essentially fraudulent, right? They're pushing fraudulent ideas, and I don't know if they're just completely delusional or if they're intentionally con artists. It's hard to say. but it seemed to me when I, as a young person, I don't want to be associated with that sort of creationism. So I thought like we need a better word because we have to distinguish ourselves because we're the serious ones and they're not serious. And yeah, I've grown up a little bit since those days. I still, to me, call a con artist a con artist, and you're done with that. Con artists, there's evolutionists who are con artists, there's atheists who are con artists, and there's Christians who are con artists. And it's not, nobody has a monopoly on thieves and liars and cheats and that sort of thing. But I don't know that I like setting myself off. I'm the best creationist or something like that. There's just something so arrogant about that. And I don't like drawing that line in the sand anymore. Maybe I ought to, but I don't. I just feel like we're all on this journey, whether we like it or not. And I get rebuked sometimes. It's very interesting. Well, I had a years-long relationship with Daryl Falk as we were trying to understand ourselves. And I would oftentimes talk about, other creationists in a, very inclusive way. This person is a creationist just like me, and I'm more similar to this creationist than I am to Daryl. And Daryl always was very annoyed with me for that because he felt like, no, you're nothing like those people. You're nothing like those people, right? So don't put yourself in that category with those people. And you name the name of Christ, and you Jesus is Lord, and you think the earth is recent and divinely created, and there was a global flood. Yeah, we're together, whether you like me or not, and whether I like you or not. So it just seems to me that that names can serve different functions, right? One function is to sort of set us off from things that we think are really important. And then another function is to sort of create divisions that maybe we ought to be looking at ways to bring people together rather than to divide us up and say, I'm not like those people, or they're not like me, or whatever. And I know there's a lot of people who want to put me in a category for that very reason, because they think I am not like that Todd Wood guy. Cool. I'm not going to be, I don't want to be that way.
It is fundamentally a sort of negative term, isn't it? Because you're defining yourself. I'm not quite like those other people, which, yeah, I agree, isn't terribly helpful. And it is divisive. I mean, we're small enough as it is. And yes, we can have our different approaches and differences, but let's not magnify that in the labels we use.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think there is a distinction to be made between being a creationist in the positive sense and being an anti-evolutionist. And again, that was something else I was trying to sort of draw out in using the term new creationist, because we're very interested in building a positive creationist model, in not just attacking evolution or poking holes in evolutionary theory, but in trying to construct a robust, scientifically and biblically sound alternative, constructing scientific theories on a biblical foundation. And I see that as creationism proper. It's the attempt to understand the history of the world from a biblical perspective. And that's different from anti-evolutionism, because actually you can be an anti-evolutionist and not be a biblical creationist in that sense. You can just oppose evolution and hold all kinds of other ideas that are not biblical ideas. I've read books like that. I'm sure you all have.
I was just thinking of that. We have a book in our library that's written by an agnostic who is an anti-evolutionist, which is just really strange.
So again, that's a distinction I think we can make between creationist and anti-evolutionist, because they're often sort of lumped together, or sort of mud. The waters are sort of a bit muddy.
And that is to me, that is less divisive and more just practical. If you you read an anti-evolutionist book, sometimes I read creationist books that I literally cannot tell what the author's position actually is. All I know is he doesn't like evolution. And so I get done and I think, I don't know, we have a cataloging system for our library, and it's based on things like progressive creation, gap theory creation, theistic evolution, young age creation. And I get done with this anti-evolution book and I don't know, I guess we'll put it in the anti-evolution category. We have one of those now because it doesn't actually take a position.
Yeah.
So I think there is something really practically useful about that. And I like to ask people, if that's not right, well, then what do you think is the real explanation for this? And sometimes that gets them thinking and sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on the person, I think.
Yeah. Now that's a good place to break. We just want to go to a couple of ads and we'll be right back in just a few moments.
You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information about any of the subjects discussed in the show, please visit us at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast. Are you confused about creation and evolution? Are you intimidated by people who tell you that only morons believe in creationism and that evolution is a proven fact? What if these challenges aren't merely problems to be solved, but an opportunity or an invitation to a lifetime of discipleship seeking God? This is the subject of The Quest, Exploring Creation's Hardest Problems, a book written by me, Todd Wood, and it presents a unique perspective on creation and evolution that encourages faith, commitment, and curiosity in the face of uncertainty. Science and biblical creation walk hand in hand as we explore God's creation. God calls us to experience the joy of questions and the beauty of his handiwork on the quest. It's available today at coresci.org/quest. You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information on sponsorship opportunities, or maybe you'd like to have a product or book reviewed or discussed on our podcast, please contact us at podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org.
Well, welcome back after the break. We're continuing our discussion about labels. What do we call ourselves? What is in a name? Another term, Todd, that has been used for our creationist position was actually proposed by Dr. Leonard Brand in his book, Faith, Reason and Earth History. I think that's where it was used, and probably in some papers that Leonard has written. The term is informed interventionist or intelligent interventionist. Now, what do you think of that term? It's obviously very, very different from the kind of terms that people are used to.
Yeah, it's got no cultural awareness to it, right? So if you described yourself as an intelligent interventionist, it's going to be a wide open door to a long conversation about, well, what do you actually think about these things?
What's an unintelligent?
Yes.
You know, only people that are unintelligent intervention.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it has the option. It has that, I guess, advantage that it opens conversation, but it doesn't. It's not widely communicative. It's not widely understood. So if you described yourself as that to an audience, for example, no one would have any idea. But the basic concept, as I understand it, is that he wants to emphasize that it's not just the original creation that's important. It is not only the original creation that's important. Not that that's not important. It's just not the only thing. So he wants to include things like the flood, the Tower of Babel, the miracles, the establishment of Israel, the establishment of David's kingdom, all the times in which God has worked in a special, personal, unique way in the history of the world. We might call it miraculous, and that those are sort of interventions in history that God has sort of inserted himself and done a special work. And so, as I understand the idea, it is bigger than just emphasizing creation or what day that happened on or when and that sort of thing. So so that's where the idea comes from. It just strikes me as too weird. There's a when we think about these kinds of labels, there's a lot of marketing ideas that have to go into it, right? What sounds good, what rolls off the tongue, what communicates the important ideas and that sort of thing. And interventionist, nobody knows what that is, so it's not necessarily a good brand recognition at this point. That's a funny word, brand recognition for brands ideas, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I like your point though about. I agree it doesn't really work as a label for those reasons, but the way that it's emphasizing the sort of link between creation and everything else God does. Creation isn't this funny separate thing. It's all tied together with everything else in redemption, and the God who intervenes at the beginning, he's intervening all the way through. That's the great God he is.
Yeah. Now, Stephen, I know that because of all of these discussions that we've had over the years about labels, we have sort of tried out lots of different labels ourselves, haven't we, in Biblical Creation Trust? You've proposed quite a few different alternatives. The one that we've kind of used almost as a kind of branding ourselves for our own organization is Biblical Creationist. I mean, it's there in the name, isn't it? Biblical Creation Trust. And I guess it has the advantage of emphasizing that we are explicitly beginning with Scripture. But again, it has some disadvantages too, doesn't it? So what do you see those as being?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we have that name, and I think you can get away with it as the name of an organization. I'd have to say that, wouldn't I, as part of it? Partly for historical, because we are sort of connected to what was the Biblical Creation Society, which sort of pre-existed us, and so we were trying to create some continuity there. So there's sort of all sorts of idiosyncratic reasons why you can have a name like this. I mean, I think the problem is that it's just a bit too sort of vague, and a theistic evolutionist would say, well, I'm biblical too, and this sort of I'm more biblical than you type approach is not terribly it's not very helpful for having a sensible discussion, I don't think, when that is sort of, if that's how it's heard.
Yeah. And the same criticism can be made of just the term creationist, can't it? Because as Todd said earlier in the episode, theistic evolutionists these days quite often want to be called evolutionary creationists. They want to sort of claim that label for themselves. And yeah, it's a great name. Yeah. I've always
everybody wants it.
Everybody wants it. I must confess, I find that slightly peculiar, because creationist does come with such a lot of baggage that I'm kind of surprised that theistic evolutionists want to claim it for themselves. And I wonder if it's something particularly to do with perhaps the American context, where perhaps theistic evolutionists are very concerned that they want to appear orthodox and in a historic Christian tradition, and so they want to claim that term back. But
I think that's there's some real don't know how to describe it. It seems risky and dangerous. Maybe that's a bad way to describe it, but yeah, when you have sort of the unsuspecting high school kid who is told by a theistic evolutionist, I'm a biblical creationist, then suddenly credibility, and we have a connection, and they don't mean anything by those words that you think they do. And I don't think it's a deception, because they really do believe that they are biblical and that they're creationists. But at the same time, I see an urgency for people to be aware of these kinds of words and how they're used, because there's risk there. There's genuine risk. involved.
And I think
Yeah,
this is
anyway.
partly cultural, because here in the UK it would probably be the opposite kind of conversation, where theistic evolutionists are wanting to distance themselves from creationists and say we're not creationists.
We don't have anything to do with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Stephen, you've proposed a number of other alternatives over the years. Dogmatic. Sorry, that was someone else's, wasn't it? Dogmatic creationist. I think Hans Madawami proposed that one. You've proposed canonical creationism, chronological creationism, Christ-centered creationism. They all begin with C, so they have the virtue of alliteration.
Yeah.
Just unpack some of those alternatives for us and tell us what you had in mind as you were thinking about those.
It's a preacher's curse, isn't it? The alliteration. Although I must admit, I normally shy away from it as a preacher, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Often these things have come about because of a particular context. And for example, the canonical creationism came from some sort of lectures I was doing in a seminary on sort of science and Christianity. And I was describing different sort of models for sort of relating things. You had complementarianism or concordism and this sort of thing. And I was wanting another sort of C to sort of go alongside that, which is where I came up with this canonical creationism, which in a sense is the same as biblical creationism, I suppose. But I was using the sort of idea of canon, as in referring to the sort of the fixed body of Scripture, to partly convey, yes, we're starting with Scripture. That's key to this position. That's the whole point. But also canonical in the sense we're using all of Scripture. It's not just about Genesis 1. It's actually the whole of Christian theology, the whole of Scripture. It's as much about the New Testament as the Old Testament. I mean, that's maybe a topic for another time, isn't it? That I think you can do the whole of creationism from the New Testament. I get so fed up with people refusing to comment on this because they say, "Oh, I'm not an Old Testament scholar." No, I don't care. It's all in the New Testament, So, sorry, I'm getting on my high horse. But and I think the other thing is it's a limiting term as well, because Scripture only talks about certain things. Scripture doesn't actually tell me a lot about dislocation mobility in metals, for example. I'm not going to it for that. It doesn't tell me a lot about genetic, mechanisms of variation. It does tell me there was a global flood. It does tell me what God made on, day 4 and this sort of thing. So it's a sort of limiting term too, that we're focusing on what Scripture actually talks about. So that's sort of where that term came from. Shall I go on to some others, or?
Yeah, chronological creationism is an interesting one, because you actually wrote a paper, didn't you, that was published in the Foundation's Theological Journal, and we'll link to that in the show notes. Now, chronology is interesting because obviously, as creationists, we are really interested in this whole issue of chronology. What were you trying to do by sort of making that part of the name?
Yeah, that paper was written as a sort of an alternative to a previous paper that had been written, basically saying, the age of the Earth isn't really an issue. And so I was trying to sort of recast the debate by sort of trying to reclaim some terminology, because, for example, you could believe in, 6 24-hour days of creation and put them 4.5 billion years ago. But that, I don't know anyone that does that, but so simply to say I'm a 6-day creationist, you could be that and believe in an old Earth, so right. It should be a bizarre position to hold, but it shows that it's not actually quite the point. It's not simply how long these days are. It's about what happened on those days. It's about sequences of events, how that relates to, the creation of humanity and everything else. And similarly, it's not that sort of there's a particular age of the Earth that suddenly makes you sort of out of bounds. It's relative to Adam. It's relative to when you think Adam was made. So it's not about a sort of particular figure in and of itself. And so this basically boils down to the idea of order of events. And really what we're saying is that the order of events in the Bible is different to that in evolutionary history. So to put it the other way around, you could say that if someone was to say, the earth was made 6,000 years ago, but you had death there right from the start, I would have big problems with that, even though they were believing in a young earth, because they're getting the order of events wrong. And what I was trying to argue is that this is actually a mainstream theological methodology, because it's actually one used by the Apostle Paul. How does he construct his theological arguments? Well, for example, in Galatians 3, he constructs his argument on the basis of what happened first, the order of events. That is actually very significant for constructing his theology. So I was just trying to apply the same principle on this whole creation issue. So that I was just trying to reframe it in that way, as a sort of, here's a biblical methodology for our creationist approach. It's not simply that we're plucking out these verses. It's actually a biblically based methodology we're using here.
And then there's also this suggestion of Christ-centered creationism. Now, this is not just an attempt at one-upmanship to say, we're more Christ-centered than you. There is actually some reasoning that's gone into this term, isn't there, Stephen?
Yeah, that made it 3 C's, which was even better, you see. So you've got CCC. And again, this was from a talk, and I think what I was doing in this talk was trying to say, rather than start with sort of Genesis 1:1, as some people do, understandably, what if we started from something that every Christian would agree is pretty central, the incarnation? So John 1:14, the word became flesh. And in effect, I was trying to sort of derive what we would call creationism, starting from there. That if you believe that and see the sort of theological implications of that, if you're going to be consistent, you basically have to be a creationist. So it's in that sense I was. It meant sort of Christ-centered, in that we're starting from Christ. We're starting from the incarnation. What implications does that have for origins? Yeah.
Now, Todd, I did briefly mention, I almost there for a moment attributed it to Stephen, but of course it was actually a suggestion by Hans Madawamy, who is a biblical scholar, and he suggested this term dogmatic creationist.
Right.
Tell us about that.
So one of the things, and I don't know that this is American creationism or if this is everywhere, but there's just there's a growing sense, I think, among the seminary world that the science has been settled. There are no more debates or no more discussion. Evolution is a fact, as Stephen Jay Gould put it. And we just have to move on, right? And we're going to have to just figure out how to deal with it theologically, because it's reality, and that's the end. And so, and implicit in that, of course, is that young age creationism as a scientific program has been a total failure. It has not provided good reasons to reject evolution, and it has not provided good evidence that the earth is young or that there are created kinds or anything like that. It's just been a total failure. So rather than just straightforwardly challenging that attitude, the idea would be with dogmatic creationism is that, we have enough warrant and justification from Scripture and the tradition of the church to say science has made some mistakes, some really big, important mistakes, and that, the earth is really young, and we're just going to be dogmatic about it. And he means it not, and I definitely need to understand this, he doesn't mean it in the bad sense of being dogmatic in this sort of pejorative way that people use it, but in the good sense of being it's just a matter of dogma. It's just a matter of our Christian faith, and we're just going to have to believe that the scientific questions are going to be resolved someday. And then, we're just going to be dogmatic creationists in the meantime. And so, it has that word dogma in it, which of course is pejorative and people don't like dogma. And so, I don't know.
But it is essentially a technical term that, for Christian doctrine or mainstream Christian doctrine. So that's how it's being used. But you're right, how it's heard by non-specialists, it's the wrong word.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about science because I'm just dogmatic about my creationism, which is not the intention, and it's certainly not the way it's supposed to be understood. And
I guess some of us might want to challenge that overly sort of pessimistic view, perhaps, of the state of the science. So that's
and I don't think Hans would say that pessimistic view is correct.
No.
In fact, I know he would say that pessimistic view is incorrect. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who are either, casually convinced because that's just what they heard, or they're intimidated by a bunch of other smart people who say that that's true. And so, who am I to judge? I don't know. It must be true. And so, he's trying to sort of fit into that world and say, look, there are other reasons besides just, the Enlightenment demands of having a rational, scientific, empirical reason, justification for every belief that you have. Sometimes God said it is really enough. So do I like it? I don't use it. Dogmatic, it's just too pejorative. And in the world of creationism, where we're already depicted as being horribly closed-minded and dogmatic, it just strikes me as really the wrong word. I don't know that I want to embrace that particular insult.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of other labels that I just want to explore before we start to sort of bring things to a conclusion. One of them, Stephen, is one that you used in a chapter that you wrote in a book. It was a chapter in Debating Darwin, published in 2009 by Paternoster, where you were kind of giving a defense of the creationist position, an argument from the resurrection of Jesus. And one of the arguments that you kind of used in that chapter was what you referred to as no agony before Adam. And I just wondered, first of all, if you could sort of unpack what you mean by that, no agony before Adam. And then perhaps this sort of leads into this latest piece that you wrote for the BCT prayer letter, where you propose this idea of ABC, and you can perhaps tell us what that means too.
Okay, that was the one Todd didn't like.
Yeah.
I think that actually the no agony before Adam, I think actually was coined by a friend of mine. But the point was to focus on the issue of suffering and therefore sort of death. So something that's very central, has an immediate link to the atonement, something apologetically very important, the problem of suffering. And saying that is absent before Adam's sin, and I guess using this term agony partly as an A to go with the Adam, but also to emphasize that, if you like, we're taking a sort of not exactly a worst case scenario, but for the sake of argument, let's assume there could be a certain limited degree of pain in the original creation. I'm not exactly sure how all that worked. I mean, it seems to me you must have had some sort of sensation, touch, or whatever. At what point does that become pain? At what point does that become something unpleasant? For the sake of argument, let's not worry too much about where you want to draw the line on that. Let's just say that if you like, the extreme pain, the pain that's much more than what's simply needed to warn of danger, something like the pain of childbirth, which just so happens to be one of the things that's mentioned there in Genesis. Let's say that wasn't there before Adam's fall, and it also actually links into animal death and suffering, we actually think animal suffering is a bad thing, which is I think a problem if you're a theistic evolutionist. So that was about just trying to sort of define the debate in the sort of a focused way, but it's only sort of one aspect of it. Now the ABC, Adam from the beginning of creation. I must tell you what my daughter thought of this later on. She wasn't happy either. Believe it or not, it didn't start with the acronym. I was actually sort of toying around with these ideas and thinking, well, actually, what I'm trying to say is you've got humanity there from the start of creation, which is totally different to, obviously, to the whole evolutionary scheme, where, you know, humanity is this afterthought. We've been around for, you know, 0.005% of Earth history. And that's what kids are taught in school. You know, they're told about humanity's insignificance on the basis of the fact that we're just this recent, you know, appearance of life on Earth. So it is it's a very sort of tangible difference in worldview to then say, no, we were there right at the beginning. Also, I think tricky for a theistic evolutionist, because if you're saying that humanity is there as the stewards of creation, well, you didn't have any humanity there for almost the entire, you know, history of creation. So, you know, what was going on then, you know? So I was thinking, humanity there from the beginning of creation. And then it suddenly occurred to me, I think as I was cycling home after I thought of this, well, hang on, it's Adam. And if you say Adam, then it becomes ABC, you know. So, and I think the thing I was positive about this label was that it did have a sort of a biblical resonance. You know, we're not using this term young. We're actually echoing Jesus's words, you know, about he created the male and female from the beginning of creation. I think the comment of one of my daughters was almost, it sounds slightly heretical, as if it's almost putting Adam, as if Adam is almost like God, you know, that it could be misheard as sort of Adam is the biggest and most important thing, which obviously isn't quite what I'm getting at. So I don't think it trips off the tongue terribly well. I don't think it's, but it does more accurately describe where we're coming from, though, I think. So I'm not set on it, but if it promotes some thought, then that's a good thing.
That's a good thought, though. I like the idea that it's you're getting it off the particular young or old issue. You're putting it back onto an issue that really does distinguish us, and it distinguishes us well, right? Because this is a pretty crucial thing, and it is what Jesus said from the beginning.
And you know, if you're an old Earth creationist, you couldn't subscribe to this. You know, a theistic evolutionist couldn't subscribe to this, or for that matter, a gap theorist. So it does actually distinguish us, because I think it's easy for people to sort of lump old Earth creationist with almost closer to young Earth creationist than theistic evolutionist, whereas actually they are far, far closer to being a theistic evolutionist because they accept the basic evolutionary chronology.
Yeah. Now, are there any other labels that, you know, while we're at it, you think we should throw into the mix and talk about, or do you think we've kind of exhausted the main possibilities? I mean, I'm sure there are others.
Yeah, there's always somebody who's got some idea of they're gonna make a new name.
Yeah.
And the trick is, we talk about all these names and nothing is caught on like Young Earth Creationist, right?
Right. Yeah.
It is, and this kind of
this kind of leads me then to the last thing that I think we should just briefly touch upon, which is, what do we do about this? You know, we've talked about these various labels. Some of them are things that we use to describe ourselves. Some of them are terms that have been applied to us. We think that all of them have pros and cons. You know, there are some advantages, there are some drawbacks. Where do we go from here? Do you have a particular preference at the moment for a label? Do you think it's even worth trying to invest effort into proposing some new label? How would that work? So what do you think about that, Stephen?
Yeah, I think it's really hard, actually, in terms of what we do about this, because you can't sort of stop other people saying things about you or describing you in certain ways. You obviously have a bit more control over how you describe yourself, but if that becomes so sort of opaque or weird, it sort of does sort of defeat the point, at least if you're not in a situation where you've got the scope to explain what you mean by that. So it does so much depend on the situation you're talking about, where you know, is this a 30-second piece on a secular radio show, or is it you're giving a lecture to a load of seminary students? It's going to be different in those different settings. And I think as well, I'm loath, someone says, oh, you're a young earth creationist, even though I don't like the label, I'm loath to sort of say I'm not, because I don't want to be seen as distancing myself from people who are basically, in a sense, I might disagree with them in different ways, but my friends and my brothers and sisters in Christ, that we are actually on the same page basically here. We might treat our science a bit differently. We might use some slightly different arguments. Some might be a bit more flaky than others, but we're on the same side. So, and I don't want to be sort of seen in almost a slightly snooty way, actually, as distancing yourself. So I think all you can do is just keep making the case to best describe what you think is the right position in the different settings you're in. And I think over time, sometimes that can change the debate. I don't know how many people use the term stratomorphic intermediate amongst creationists or for that matter, anti-creationists, but I'm sure if you just keep doing it all the time, eventually people will start adopting that a bit.
Todd, have you got any final thoughts?
Yeah. For me, what it's come down to is just basically spelling out what I really think about things, giving a thoughtful and measured and nuanced position on whatever. So, it's always, yes, I am a young age creationist, but let me tell you what that means. And then sort of, spell it out. So right now I'm working on probably shouldn't say this, but I will anyway. I'm working on a big thing to try to tie together philosophy of science, the relationship of science and faith, and hermeneutics all into one big package. And it's insane and complicated, and I probably bit off more than I can chew, and who knows if it'll ever see the light of day. But yeah, I think that's the sort of thing that I want to do is just sort of lay all my cards on the table. This is what I think. Okay, and I'm not holding anything back. I'm not going to try to trick you or just unstate some certain assumption that's really critical. I want everybody to know just this is what I think. And to me, that's at least as important as a name. The name is important. Yep, I agree. And it would be nice if we had a nice, convenient name for the sorts of things that we believe and why we think they're important. But at the end of the day, the people who are sort of turned off by a name necessarily are maybe not the ones I really want to interact with anyway. I want those thoughtful people who are thinking, well, what kind of weirdo would believe this? Why would you think that? And yeah, and they're willing to pick up a book or they're willing to look at a YouTube video or something and try to figure out, what's this guy's problem? Is he crazy? Yeah, let me tell you all about it. And now I got an audience that's actually going to try to engage with what I'm thinking rather than just, shooting names at me. So yeah, that's pretty much where I've landed on this question.
Well, that's been a fascinating discussion, and we're very, very grateful to you, Stephen, for joining us for this episode and exploring some of these very interesting questions with us. Do check us out on social media. Like, share, subscribe, leave us a positive review wherever you find our podcast. You can check out all of our streaming options, and you'll also find the show notes on the podcast webpage. Todd, where do people find that?
The podcast webpage is at coresci.org/podcast. And that's coresci.org. And there you will find the archive of past shows. You will also find the show notes that will give you links to all the sorts of things that we discussed in an episode. So you can check up on us and make sure that we've cited and referenced everything correctly.
And if you've got any questions or comments about the things that we've been talking about today or in any of our other episodes, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at podcast@coresci.org. And finally, please do consider donating if you've enjoyed listening to the podcast. We really do appreciate your support. We can't do what we do without your support. We're both Core Academy of Science and Biblical Creation Trust are both quite small organizations, and your gifts, however small, really do make a very big difference. If you want to find out how to give to Biblical Creation Trust, then you can visit our webpage. It's biblicalcreationtrust.org, and there's a donate button on the homepage. And Todd, how would people give to Core Academy?
You can visit us at coresci.org/donate, and that will give you our address where you can send checks, or you can sign up for a regular debit on PayPal, or you can just make a PayPal contribution, one-time deal. And yes, we're entering that final point of the year here where we're really scrambling to meet our budget, and we would be very, very grateful for your support. If you've really enjoyed what we've been doing this year with the podcast, and I know I have, how about some financial support for our continuing work here?
Yeah, that would be very, very welcome. Well, Todd, I don't think we know at this point what we're going to be doing in our next episode. So people are just going to have to come along and tune in to find out what the topic is next time. But that will be in 2 weeks' time. The next episode will drop in a fortnight, and we'll see you there.
All right. See you later.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.